Coming up in today's newscast, Prime Minister Netanyahu vows to facilitate Ukrainian-Israeli immigrants' access to their old pensions. Israel aids Gazans in their efforts to emigrate from the Strip, and Palestinian police crack down on an LGBTQ human rights group. For the first time ever, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that he will allow Israeli immigrants from the Ukraine to access pensions from their home country. And speaking while in Kiev on a state visit, Netanyahu added that Israel will send Ukraine information about Israeli immigrants from the Ukraine so that they can start receiving their payments ASAP. Well, this is big news for Israeli immigrants from the former Soviet Union, since a third of them hail from the Ukraine. Interestingly, though, this development isn't really new. It was part of a bilateral agreement signed in 2014, which was just never put in place. But now, in a joint press conference with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Netanyahu vowed to make good on Israel's promise.
I want to thank you for your decision to ratify in the upcoming parliament to work towards the ratification of a pensions agreement that we signed for these people. You asked that we pass on to you updated information for this purpose. I will definitely do that.
But those critical of Netanyahu would say that this move is not an altruistic one, and that this is actually a ploy to get support from Russian speakers in Israel ahead of next month's election. In fact, securing pensions was a campaign promise made by political rival Avigdor Lieberman. However, Netanyahu's visit does go beyond mere politics, too. In discussions with Zelensky, the two spoke about a free trade agreement between Israel and Ukraine and technological cooperations. The two leaders also discussed ongoing tensions between Ukraine and Russia, which resulted from the latter annexing Crimea. Similarly, also up for discussion was going over shared security concerns between the two countries, where Zelensky said that Ukraine had much to learn from Israel when it comes to combating threats. And speaking of security, Netanyahu later hinted to journalists covering his visit that Israel was responsible for recent airstrikes against Iranian targets in Iraq. He said that Iran has no immunity anywhere, and that Israel will act against them whenever it's necessary. So it's very possible that Netanyahu was referring to a massive explosion that took place in a Baghdad weapons depot controlled by an Iranian-backed Shiite militia last week. And while this is not the first time Israel has acted against Iran on Iraqi soil, don't expect confirmation of these attacks from an Israeli official often. Now, for less flattering news coming out of the Ukraine visit, Sarah Netanyahu, wife of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was caught on camera committing a major diplomatic faux pas. This, as when the Netanyahu's plane touched down in Kiev, the pair were gifted with a loaf of bread by Ukrainian women in traditional garb. But instead of eating a piece of the karvai bread, which was offered as a sign of respect, Sarah Netanyahu dropped it to the ground. Her husband, the prime minister, however, has already come to Sarah's defense, saying that she did not intend to offend her hosts. In fact, her choice of attire, a canary yellow pantsuit with a blue button-up shirt, was even apparently chosen in honor of the host country. Yellow and blue, of course, being the colors of the Ukrainian flag. Additionally, Prime Minister Netanyahu accused the press of blowing the incident out of proportion and vowed that the Ukrainian government was in no way offended by Sarah Netanyahu's actions. Still, though, the Ukrainian press and media would beg to differ, as many were upset by Sarah's actions. And this wasn't the only controversial incident regarding Sarah Netanyahu on this trip, as according to Channel 12 News, her own security guards had to apparently restrain her from approaching the pilot of the plane flying them to the Ukraine. Why? Because apparently she was offended that the pilot did not mention her name when first greeting the Prime Minister's delegation. Sarah Netanyahu, for her part, however, has not commented on either incident. In other news, the Blue and White and Israel Beitenu parties have just officially signed a surplus vote-sharing agreement, much to the chagrin of the other parties across the political spectrum. Prime Minister Netanyahu's Likud party even released a scathing warning regarding the deal within 20 minutes of its signing. Well, here now to discuss the agreement further, we have political strategist Zohar Tal. Zohar, thank you so much for coming in.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So, first of all, I just want to start with the basics. What exactly is in this agreement? What does it mean for these two parties?
Yeah, so it actually means that the leftover votes after spreading the parliament seats for all parties is now split with between these two parties. So that means they can gain one more seat at the parliament. Now,
either for Blue and White or Israel Beitenu, yes, whichever one has more percentage.
Well, actually,
of that seat.
The formula prioritizes the larger faction, so it is a much higher chance that Blue-White will gain the additional seat.
Regardless of whether or not the extra percentage was actually
True.
Lieberman's.
Yeah, that's true.
I see. Okay.
So, and I think that actually we've just seen Lieberman making his first large mistake in this campaign because it now makes it pretty clear that he is transferring right votes into the left.
Well, so my question, before we go down this path with Lieberman and whether or not that was a politically smart move, how many other parties either have or had this kind of agreement before? Because I know that it's not illegal. This is not like a new
Yeah, it always happens.
Concept.
Typically, it is a blockwise agreement. So let's say the Likud would have an agreement with the Jewish House or with the Yamina now, the right-wing parties,
Sure.
and Labor would have an agreement with the Meretz or.
But no other groups currently, no other parties in this upcoming September election.
Yeah,
have
no,
this
not
deal.
yet, but it will happen. It
I see.
always does. But it is interesting here because it's a statement. Lieberman always said, "I'll just bring the two together, blue and white and Likud. I don't care who will be prime minister. I just want a unity government." But now he has taken sides. He has taken the blue-white side, saying we want Gantz to be prime minister. And since Lieberman does weigh heavily on Russian votes, which are typically right-wing, Likud party is right to say that he will take right-wing votes and transfer them to the left. And he called his own bluff.
Well, so that brings us back around to kind of my next set of questions: is how do you really think that this is going to play out in real numbers come September? Do you think that more right-wing voters may maybe leave, especially Russian voters, maybe leave Israel Beitenu's camp and vote for somebody else entirely? Mm-hmm. Will it maybe draw some votes in because it shows some sort of cooperation between the two parties?
I think it
right?
will definitely harm Lieberman. I don't think that he has anything to benefit from it. Blue-white are the winners of that because they can win another seat at the Knesset. And I think it will benefit Likud because Likud is a right-wing secular party that will now draw more votes. And as you know, Likud has now a very strong Russian voters headquarters,
Sure.
and they will definitely bite on that one.
All right. So, and then finally, you believe that maybe the Likud will come out ahead in the end because, again, we're talking about in the end one seat.
Yeah.
With the surplus agreement. So, will it really have that big of an effect, or are we talking about a seat or two here?
Well, first of all, we'll have to wait and see.
Sure.
But if you ask my opinion, blue-white can gain up to one seat because of that. But
Sure.
Lieberman can lose much more because if voters turn to Likud, he can lose 3 or 4 seats. And that is a game changer.
All right. Zohar Tal, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
All right, moving on. Amidst continuing financial crisis, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas has just apparently fired all of his personal advisors, and this according to Abbas's office, following a string of heavy cuts to government salaries. Additionally, President Abbas has reportedly called on the former PA Prime Minister and ex-cabinet ministers to return tens of thousands of dollars that they were given in a pay raise, which Abbas secretly approved 2 years prior. But at least to some Palestinian officials, this move doesn't come as a complete surprise. Several official statements on Monday even explain how this decision comes amidst ongoing efforts to reduce spending in the wake of Israeli and U.S. sanctions. Israel, of course, announced back in February that it would begin withholding tax revenues collected on behalf of the PA, amounting to upwards of $10 million per month, which is equivalent to the salaries the PA paid terrorists and their families in its so-called pay-for-slay program in 2018. In response, however, the PA accuses Israel of blackmail and refuses to accept the rest of the $180 million monthly that Israel collects in taxes and customs duties, thus hitting the Palestinian budget with another 65% loss. And this has largely since been expressed in salary cuts, while terrorist salaries continue. Then meanwhile, for the United States' side, Washington, D.C. has also cut hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to the Palestinians, similarly in reference to pay-for-slay policies. This after the PA also cut ties to the U.S. over the U.S.'s embassy move. And to make matters worse, the new United States Embassy in Jerusalem on Monday postponed a scheduled conference in Ramallah when PA officials and groups called for protests against the American visit. Meanwhile, in the Gaza Strip, tens of thousands of Gazan Palestinians are looking to get out of the Strip as soon as possible. And apparently, according to a senior official accompanying Prime Minister Netanyahu in Ukraine, Israel is doing everything to help such dreams come true. In fact, various reporters quoted the unnamed official as saying that Jerusalem has for a year been facilitating talks with other nations, mostly Arab states in the Middle East, to get these states to absorb Gazan immigrants. Additionally, it was mentioned that anyway, over 35,000 Gazans left during the past year alone on their own, primarily into Egypt through the border in the Sinai, before then typically flying elsewhere from Cairo. The Israeli source explains that the Palestinians are being held hostage in Gaza and that today countries are not raising the humanitarian situation in the Strip. But further, beyond simply facilitating immigrant absorption, Israel is reportedly also ready to absorb the costs of such emigration. The Jewish state even offered to use Israeli airfields for the travel. The problem then is that apparently few, if any, Middle Eastern nations approached by Israel have agreed to absorb the Palestinians thus far. But at any rate, these comments come from Ukraine just a day after Prime Minister Netanyahu indicated he'd be willing to launch a large-scale invasion of the Gaza Strip against Hamas, and this in response to yet another upswing in violence emanating from the coastal enclave. Speaking of Hamas, it appears that Hezbollah has now begun ripping pages out of the Hamas terrorist handbook, as a fire has just broken out alongside Israel's northern border with Lebanon. And according to footage of the blaze, it appears that it was a Hezbollah-driven arson attack. In fact, the video shows Hezbollah terrorists setting multiple fires along the border, which, thanks to heavy winds, spread to an IDF base and the nearby community of Margaliot. Also, the footage reveals UN peacekeepers witnessing the flames, but making no effort to put them out. And to make matters worse, the fires set off landmines across the border, resulting in firefighters spending hours trying to extinguish the blaze. But sadly, this probably won't be the last fire we see along Israel's northern front, as it's become a powerful and cheap tactic to distract IDF forces. Further, this is a tactic that Hamas has mastered over the course of a year, after it repeatedly sent improvised incendiary devices across the border, which quickly burst into flame. To that end, since last year's March of Return protests began, Israel had to put out 1,954 arson attacks by Palestinian terrorists. This recent Hezbollah attack, however, also comes after Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah issued a stern warning to Israel, where Nasrallah said that if Israel enters Lebanon, there will be a, quote, live broadcast of destruction of Israeli brigades. The Hezbollah terror leader also praised the most recent terror attacks in the West Bank, a stabbing and a car ramming which left 1 Israeli dead and 2 injured, adding that those incidents are evidence of the next generation of Palestinian resistance. But all the while, a nonplussed Netanyahu fired back, saying that he's not impressed by Nasrallah's comments, especially as they come from the depths of his bunker. Further, and along the same lines, Nasrallah's comments come accompanied by threatening video clips released just this past weekend, which appear to show 13-year-old footage from the Second Lebanon-Israel War. In other news, in the West Bank, Palestinian violence is also now extending again towards the LGBTQ+ community, as the Palestinian Authority police on Saturday just banned the Al-Quds Palestinian LGBT rights group from organizing. And in fact, according to the police's statement, PA officers are threatening to arrest Al-Quds members for planning activities that, quote, go against and infringe upon the higher principles and values of Palestinian society, end quote. Further, police spokesperson Louay Arzekat called on the Palestinian public to report on any Al-Quds activity to help charge the supposed suspicious parties for sowing discord into society. Well, in response, the Al-Quds NGO called the police statement very unfortunate and challenged the PA to learn more about its humanitarian efforts. Al-Quds says that it's at the forefront of vibrant Palestinian cultural and social change, building LGBTQ communities and promoting new ideas about the role of gender and sexual diversity in political activism, civil society institutions, media, and everyday life. To that end, the organization, founded in 2001 with offices in Haifa and East Jerusalem, was also planning a 2-day workshop for late August, the point of which was to supposedly provide a safe space for gay, lesbian, bi, and transgender Palestinian youths to meet, learn basic concepts, and explore the different aspects of human sexuality. That said, the organization also calls against Israel for pinkwashing by saying that Israel's occupation somehow supports the patriarchal and homophobic systems in place in the PA. It's also worth noting, though, that the PA police's ban comes only after Al-Quds began organizing its August workshop in the PA. Further, Israel does indeed support one of the world's largest gay pride parades annually, drawing over 250,000 people to Tel Aviv just earlier this year. And the city has also been rated as one of the best or most gay-friendly cities on earth by multiple sources. The major problems here, then, do arise societally, as there are no laws in the Palestinian Authority against homosexual acts. Rather, societal and familial pressures at times become deadly. And that's why, among others, Ahmad Harb, the Commissioner General of the Independent Commission for Human Rights, called on the PA police to rescind its policy. Harb even wrote on Facebook that the police's statement rises to the level of calling for community violence and inciting a crime. Al-Quds, for its part, however, has already vowed to continue in its mission in the safest way possible. Now, Israel's decision to ban United States Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib from entering the country continues to ignite a firestorm of controversy across the United States. And in a joint press conference on Monday, the two said that the United States should cut off all aid to Israel as a consequence for the ban. Though the two haven't been shy of their support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, against Israel in the past, which is why Israel decided to bar their entry into the country in the first place. Still, Omar decried the ban and lamented that although it's unusual for a sitting U.S. lawmaker to be banned from entering Israel, this is the reality for anyone who threatens the quote-unquote occupation. She also said that such a ban does nothing to further the peace process, and as a result, she says that the $3 billion in aid that Israel receives from the U.S. annually should be contingent on freezing the settlements and giving Palestinians equal rights. Then as for Rashida Tlaib, whose grandmother resides in the West Bank, she similarly decried the Israeli decision, while tearfully sharing recollections of going through checkpoints with her parents as a child. And this after Israel offered to allow Tlaib's personal visit on the grounds that she not promote BDS during her trip. But Tlaib refused outright, tweeting that, quote, "silencing me and treating me like a criminal is not what my grandmother wants for me." Never mind that Tlaib's grandmother just days earlier told Reuters reporters that she believed her Congresswoman granddaughter would still come.
الله يهده أنا مبسوط بدي تيجي كلها مبسوطة بدها تيجي ستة تشوفها أنا قلبي بكون بدها تيجي.
Meanwhile, as for Israel, Netanyahu called to condemn the two lawmakers long before the ban was announced. In fact, in a letter dating back to June 2nd, Netanyahu wrote to Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, where he said that the two were the antithesis of bipartisan support. Further, Netanyahu wrote the letter after seeing Tlaib and Omar's names on a petition in support of allowing entry to Israel to Human Rights Watch's American Director for Israel and Palestine, Omar Shakir. But anyway, it looks like this saga has extended far beyond Omar and Tlaib and has now enraged nearly all of the Democratic Party. They're so livid, in fact, that there's even talk amongst a dozen or so Democrats to now censor U.S. Ambassador to Israel David Friedman and Israeli Ambassador Ron Dermer for their part in this tiff. Moving on to economic news, the Bank of Israel is now warning that the lack of integrating ultra-Orthodox into the workforce will cause major financial problems for Israel down the line. As according to a report released by the agency on Sunday, ultra-Orthodox men in Israel are woefully undereducated in comparison to their less religious or secular counterparts. In fact, since the 1970s, there's been a steady decline in ultra-Orthodox boys learning essential subjects like English, math, and science. And this has caused major gaps in knowledge and quality of life between the ultra-Orthodox and the rest of the population. So while a recent study by the Taub Center for Social Policy says that the ultra-Orthodox engaged in academic studies is actually increasing, the numbers are still low. Then what's worse is that the courses they do often enroll in are not conducive to obtaining work in the job market. This, as unfortunately many Orthodox Jews believe that math, science, and English are a waste of time with no reason to be pursued. Well, as a result, many ultra-Orthodox drop out of school because they don't want to take non-religious courses. And that in turn has led to a situation where the average Haredi man has to complete 19 years of schooling to prepare for the job market compared to just 10 years for secularly schooled students. And therefore, the Bank of Israel is actually now calling on politicians to intervene with political solutions to rectify the matter. And finally, it's also worth noting that the report wasn't only limited to the ultra-Orthodox. It also gave comprehensive recommendations as to how to increase productivity in Israeli society in general, with one suggestion being to reduce the school week to 5 days instead of 6, while hiring better quality teachers. In other news, a recently released health ministry report has just detailed the leading causes of death in Israel, and surprise, surprise, cancer is by far the most common killer. This with the next 3 most common causes of death being heart disease, cerebrovascular disease, and diabetes. But combined, these 4 diseases make up 51% of Israel's total mortality rate. Though that said, overall mortality rates have dropped by 27% from 2000 to 2016, the last year for which the report has data. And at any rate, cancer still accounts for approximately a quarter of all deaths in Israel, except for the age range of 0 to 4. Then heart disease accounted for around a sixth of all the deaths and was prominent mostly among ages 25 and up. But the mortality rates from these diseases are consistent and comparable to the top causes of death in Europe, Canada, and the United States. So the only difference is that in America, heart disease is actually number 1 and cancer is number 2. Then meanwhile, the other killers in the top 10 include septicemia or blood poisoning in 5th place, a large rise over the last few years, by the way, considering how the disease didn't even make it into the top 10 in the other countries compared. Then kidney disease comes in 6th, with dementia in 7th, chronic lower respiratory disease in 8th, pneumonia and influenza in 9th place, and finally accidental deaths in 10th. On Israel's roads, for example, more than 300 people are killed each year in car accidents alone. But remember, again, Israel's overall mortality rate is low in comparison with the United States and European countries, with the rate in 2015 being 896 people per 100,000. Israel even has the 4th lowest mortality rate for males. So the death rate was higher only than France at 828 per 100,000, Switzerland at 857, Spain at 864, Canada at 869, Luxembourg also at 869, and Italy at 886. Now, in a new piece of regulation that is likely the first of its kind, Israel is taking up the front lines in the battle against the illegal trade of elephant ivory. And the Jewish state is doing this by actually banning the sale of products allegedly originating from the woolly mammoth, an extinct species.
Further, some 180 nations are sending delegates to the World Wildlife Conference in Geneva later this month to draft international protections for at-risk animals, particularly in relation to the demand for ivory and shark fin soup. The conference, known as CITES, assembles every 3 years, and this year it convenes on Saturday, August 24th, ending August 28th. But again, ahead of the summit, Israel is already setting up provisions to protect elephants from poaching in a proposed amendment for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And the overview, in part, explains that the woolly mammoth should be included in the Convention's lookalike provisions, with the purpose of preventing illegal trade in living elephants by preventing laundering or mislabeling elephant ivory, adding that since mammoth ivory trade is almost totally unregulated and undocumented, and because mammoth ivory is nearly indistinguishable from elephant ivory, there's a tangible risk of illegal trade in elephant ivory being facilitated by deliberate mislabeling. Additionally, the proposal clarifies that the amendment is not intended to stop mammoth ivory trade altogether, but rather to facilitate its documentation and better understanding of its implications on living elephant populations. Then finally, aside from this new mammoth-related proposal, the Israeli Nature and Parks Authority announced on Sunday that it would start enforcing new regulations on all ivory trade as of January 2021. And the new regulations would allow possession of old ivory dating back to before the 1970s, while outlawing all trade of all ivories produced beyond that date, with very few specific exceptions.
And now for Today in History. On August 20th, 1684, the Jews of Buda, half of today's Budapest, Hungary, ratified and celebrated their first Purim Buda. But why? What does Purim Buda even celebrate? Well, in the weeks leading up to August 20th, a giant riotous mob began laying siege to the Jewish ghetto of Buda, the half of Budapest that sits on the right bank of the Danube River. Because, you see, there was a war going on between Venice and Turkey, and the mob accused the Jews in the ghetto at the time of praying for the Turks' success in attacking the region. In actuality, though, the Jews were simply in synagogue marking Tisha B'Av, or the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av, which commemorates the destruction of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem. So therefore, when the local authorities finally put an end to the violence 2 weeks later, on August 20th, the Jews celebrated and marked the day as a Thanksgiving of sorts, aka the Purim of Buda. Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Just like a broken record, tonight will again be partly cloudy and warm with a low of 77 or 25 degrees Celsius. Then tomorrow you can expect a high of 88 or 31 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.53 shekels to the American dollar. For more news from ILTV, please subscribe at iltv.tv. And finally, do not forget to like us on Facebook at Israel English News or to follow us on Twitter at ILTV News. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.